We get involved in all these protocols and the meetings and committees, and all of that's fine. But it's not really the ministry. The ministry is to build disciples and to build relationships.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Disciple Standard Podcast. We're glad that you're joining us. Today's a special day. I am going to be joined by David Snapper. We just had this long conversation, which you're going to be let in on, and it's about church planting. Our denomination is in the process of coming up with a new vision centered around church renewal, church planting, disciple making, the gospel. We're holding a conference here in Port St. Lucie in November around those topics. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is just start generating ideas when it comes to this vision. I think David is a person who has a lot of insight, and I hope you enjoy our conversation.
The future is now.
David Snapper, welcome to the Disciple Standard Podcast. Glad that you're joining us. It's just going to be you and I today. Our host, who's normally with us, Aaron, is away in the Philippines at his grandmother's funeral. So he isn't here for those who regularly watch our podcast. But it's just David and I, and I'd like to just give my own introduction about David, and then I'm probably going to let him do way more talking than I'm going to do today. I first met David in 2010. I went to a Christian Reformed Synod in Chicago, and it just so happened that I got there. I sat down at our table, and David happened to be the person who was sitting next to me. And we introduced ourselves to each other, and I don't know exactly how we got into it, but at some point or another, I realized, wow, here's somebody I have to spend a bunch of time getting to know and talking, and I really have no idea what that synod was about or what topics there were. But David was printing papers and handing me articles, and I actually couldn't get enough because I realized he was really onto something. I'll let you talk a little bit about your background and history and planting a church and how you got into this research project you were undertaking and why you were interested to talk to me of all the people in the world. Maybe it's just because we're sitting next to each other, but a lot of the things that we wound up talking about, I believe, had a profound impact on my ministry as pastor of Sunlight Community Church and what we've been trying to do here in South Florida. So in November, we're going to have this church planting conference for our denomination. We're hosting it here at Sunlight, along with our classes. And in preparation for that, you know, we're really trying to get a new vision for our denomination in church planting. And I thought to myself, well, I know someone who's an expert who probably should have been consulted a long time ago in many, many different ways. And so as we try to anticipate the conference and generate ideas, I wanted to bring David on and just have a conversation that we'll make sure to post, and hopefully we can get a lot of engagement from other Christian Reformed people around this topic, especially as we anticipate to do it together at the conference. Anyway, David, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Here's how I think I'd like to start. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? You know, where'd you grow up? Who were you as a kid? How in the world did you become a pastor? All those kinds of things.
Sure. Thank you so much, Scott. You know, I really appreciate this. We did have a great time at Synod, and I'm not particularly comfortable in large meetings with overwhelming protocol and procedure and people who are very familiar and comfortable with that world, that life. And I found my great escape was to talk to you because we had something in common.
Yeah.
And we shared it. And we got through this trying event and came out the other side much better for the experience. I thank God for that time. So thank you for this. Let me pick up just a moment in the midstream. There's a professor at maybe Harvard who speaks on communication and the psychology of communication. He says some people are cursed with knowledge, meaning they know so much about a very narrow subject
right.
that when they speak, nobody understands them. or they have such a narrow
Yep.
range of conversation that they get lost. I want to start out right at the beginning, tell everyone what I'm trying to communicate with you. I was a church planner starting in 1984, and I retired in 2014, so it gave me 30 years exactly.
Okay.
Right in the middle of that, sometime around 1995, I looked at myself and I wondered what went wrong. Why was it that all my church planning friends and I had failed? And
Mm.
there was a very specific definition of success, and that was 200 people in your church. If you have 200 people, you're a successful church planner. If you have fewer than 200 people, you're a failure.
Okay.
And this is painful,
Now,
because
that was
all my
just the
friends.
going definition at that time in the mid 90s?
Oh, absolutely. C. Peter Wagner in the School of Church Growth had defined success by being 200 people.
Yeah.
It started with Donald McGavran in the 1930s. Now, see, this is the curse of knowledge. I can go off on too many sidetracks, but help me stay focused, okay? Excuse me. So
All right. So there
I
was
looked
kind
at,
of a fuller school of missions that was the predominant idea of the day
exactly,
in the 80s and 90s.
exactly,
And you
exactly.
somehow or another had bought in.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely.
And
We were,
we're
yeah,
talking about our
go ahead.
denomination. So at that time, would you have said that our home missions agency had completely bought in as well? This was just like the paradigm that everyone was a part of?
It absolutely was. Yes, this was the paradigm of what church planning was all about. That you needed to reach 200. The technology and the strategy, things I'll discuss a little bit later, were all geared towards breaking what was called the 200 barrier.
Yeah.
And you could be a rancher, you could be a shepherd, you could use technology, you could use mailing, you could use but one way or another, 200, that was it.
Okay.
So what I looked at was, why were all of us who were church planners failing at such a spectacular rate? I mean, of all the people who should have succeeded, it was us. We were trained, we were gone to school, we'd been equipped in every way for this. And I read, uh, well, I would watch some of the great preachers around the country. Rick Warren was was already at that time a
Yeah.
very successful church planner. And then I looked at myself, and he has 20,000 people, and I have 100 people, and I'm saying, is he really 2,000 times better than I am? Is his day 40,000 hours long, or how? Why is
Yeah.
this? Why all these gifted pastors were failing all over the place? And the answer came for me one day when I was on deputation. I went to Escondido to explain what we were doing on what was called deputation, and I realized that I was going to make a speech, and late the night before I was praying, God, what am I going to say? How do I explain this? And Peter in Acts chapter 2 stands up, delivers a very confusing sermon in Acts chapter 2. 5,000 people are converted.
Mm.
Paul goes out in Ephesus and goes up to not Ephesus, but on Mars Hill, and
In
he
Athens.
delivers Athens. Thank you. Arguably one of the best messages cross-cultural ever given, and they walk away and laugh.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, was Peter 5,000 times better than Paul? How can we account for these differences? How can we explain why one situation is successful and one is unsuccessful? What do we do to make sense of that? Especially as a church planner, where you're living right in the middle of this. I'm doing everything I knew how to do, the best I knew how to do it.
And
And
let's just I don't remember if we talked about this, but you went to Washington State and you're out by Puget Sound. You're planting a church. You started in 1984. You're 10 years in. What's the state of the church? Like, how were things?
Great. Just like most churches at this time, so the context here is really important because it's going to set up
Okay.
our conversation for discipleship, and I think this is where you fit in to this theme, and you're going to sort of pick up the narrative from where I drop it. But at that time, a church planter was sent out into a region which was remote from other Christian Reformed churches. So
Yeah.
I was sent to Silverdale, Washington. It wasn't even on a map in 1984 of
Really?
like a national map. You had to have a local map to find Silverdale. You still do. It was a little village between submarine bases for the Navy, aircraft carriers, and torpedoes. So you're right in the middle of what's called Ground Zero. But it's a little village serving the military community there. And we are an hour's drive from the nearest church or a 2 hour ferry boat ride in the other direction. So
How
we're
was that location chosen? Did you choose it, or did our denomination choose it?
what now this is a great question. It was chosen because it was growing and it was isolated.
Okay.
And the thought of the School of Church Growth was that if you plant a church close to an existing Christian Reformed church, the existing Christian Reformed church will corrupt this pristine new ministry effort.
Oh,
Sort of like Pisidian Antioch, the synagogue
yeah.
interrupted with the Gentiles. So if you get too close, they'll disrupt the good ministry that the local missionary is attempting to accomplish. Well,
Okay.
it turns out that when we're isolated and we're sent all as far as possible from the support of the nearing churches, that we're left to our own devices. And at 10 years in, we were at 100 people. That was as large as we would ever get. Um, and we had no name recognition, no one to fall back on, no camaraderie among the churches. We
Hmm.
might as well have been on another planet. We wouldn't get a church visit. We were just isolated and left to our own devices.
Hmm.
And part of that was great because we were undisturbed. But part of it meant that we didn't have support
Right.
that so many of us need. So at this point, I'm 100 people. We have the typical disruptive event when a church gets planted. There's always some sort of leadership crisis.
Yeah.
We'd gone through our first leadership crisis in about 1991, and I'm reeling from the dismay that all the things that we had learned in the School of Church Growth didn't happen.
Hmm.
So the only conclusion was that we had failed, and by we I mean me, I, and many of my colleagues. We were sent into similar circumstances and situations, and couldn't get past. We didn't even get close to 200,
Yeah.
and that's all across the country. That was all
Now,
over.
at that time, how many churches on average was a Christian Reformed church planting a year? Because the way you're speaking, there was multiple things going around the country all simultaneously.
That's true. We were in a very large church planting effort at that time. We'd wanted to become Americanized as opposed to being
Hmm.
Dutch. Well, those days are pretty far in the rearview mirror,
Yeah.
but at that time, this was the culture. We were planning, I would guess, 8 churches a year were being planted. The budget was very much in the many millions of dollars a year for
Hmm.
church planting, maybe $10 million a year when I did my
To plant
doctoral
churches.
research to plant churches.
And
And not just planting, but all the mission work.
yeah, and in your case, I mean, were you receiving heavy financial support from the denomination?
We did for several years receive significant, I don't remember the numbers at this point, but yes, we did. We received a lot of support from the denomination.
And so, were you at some point in the process of church planting, you were able to purchase land and build a building, or how did that work out?
Okay. So when I arrived in 1984, I drove around with a real estate broker just to get a feel of the land. He was a
Yeah.
Christian and cared for churches. We drove up to an exit from the highway, which had no exit. This is just all trees. It's very
Okay.
rough country. And there's an exit, but no road. It just ended in the forest. And I said, this is where God wants us to plant a church. And so I wrote Pope and Talbot and asked them for the property, and they said, of course not. They couldn't give me
Okay.
any property. But because they had a 4,000 home development plan for
Oh,
the future. That
okay.
Home Missions did come out, and unknown to me, they bought the property and other property as an investment on the Ridgetop Boulevard. And 15 years later, they gave us that property on the condition that we wouldn't bail out of the Christian Reformed Church.
Huh.
So there were strings attached to it, but which was fine with me. So that's how we got it. Yes, it
But
was a great support.
there might be any number of current church planters who would just marvel that there was a denominational support such that here was the perfect property as far as you could tell, and next thing you knew, the denomination just purchased it, and they had it waiting for you at some point.
True. Yes, that doesn't happen anymore.
No.
And so we were in a situation which was very much unlike the current church planting model. But yes, so at 10 years in, we were in our fifth or sixth building,
Okay.
moving around from place to place, trying to gather.
Yeah.
Mostly military people. So we would gather them, then they would move away, and we'd gather more, and they would move away, and yeah, it was highly transient. We had Christian Reformed Church people from many locations. The denomination, as wisdom, chose to stop making the military directory, which printed the list of military-related churches. So it was a little harder to find us for people, but there we were.
Huh.
And eventually we got to the point where we had to build, and we built in 2000, lovely building on that property. And then I stayed another 14 years, and then it was time to retire. So
Just listening
that
to the
was
story, now, upon reflection, I would think, wow, success. You gathered up 100 people. You were able to build a building on a property. You got the church established. It's still in existence today. Yeah, this is what, 50 years later, 40 years later?
yeah, it's 40 years later.
40 years later?
I'm not
But
that
at the time, you weren't feeling success, and
That's
maybe
right.
even being told this is an example of failure.
That is exactly correct. That's
Okay.
exactly correct.
So-
and that's what motivated me to continue. I'd started a THM at seminary in 1979, 78, 79. And then I picked up and made a D-Min out of it in 1995, approximately.
And
And
here's what I saw when we were talking at Synod, and it was impressive. Is you seem to have almost fingertip knowledge of every single church in our denomination, what their history was, how things went, what factors contributed either to struggle or success. And I just thought to myself, wow, here is a fountain of knowledge and wisdom. I wonder if I could get you to just sort of talk through some of what you discovered, because at some point, this is my impression, so you can correct me if I have the wrong impression. My impression was you would sort of been told, all right, this is a failure, you should move on. I think you weren't ready to move on. You had planted that church, so you were going to stay, but you had time on your hands, and maybe you didn't like being called a failure, so you wanted to find out what's underneath the hood. And maybe all that was sort of motivating you to figure out, okay, I've been sold something, but I no longer want to buy it. What's the truth here? And some of what you were being told, kind of motivated by this Fuller School of Missions, you discovered to not be all that helpful or true. And anyway, just take it up from there. Did I get it right, or do I kind of have it wrong?
Well, you're right. There's so many factors that go into a person's life, and they all came together in that question. And I'm really trying to keep it focused. My father was in the military when I was born. He was a
Okay.
27-year Marine Corps fighter pilot. He flew the Corsair in World War II, and then in
Wow.
Korea, and then in Vietnam. So I grew up without having a home or a community.
Huh.
And when I went to Grand Rapids during the Vietnam War, my dad was in the war, and we lived in Grand Rapids because it was the only place we had relatives. Not the only place, but the best place for
Yeah.
us for support for my mom. And I experienced for the first time a community
Hmm.
that I'd never had before, and I was fascinated by that. And I'll come back to this, but when I went to become a preacher, and I went to a military community, and I swore I'd never go to a military community again in my life because I couldn't stand
Yeah.
it. So there I am, surrounded by torpedoes, submarines, and aircraft carriers. Hunt for Red October was in our backyard. So so here I am, and I'm saying I can't stand this. And then I saw those little kids, and I thought of me, and I said, I want to build a community for those kids.
Oh.
And so I stayed, and I couldn't uh, turn my back on that. And so
Yeah.
that's how I got here. That's why I was committed. I was committed to making a safe, strong community of Christian nurture and support and
Yeah.
discipleship. And now that part, as far as I'm concerned, we were wildly successful. The kids grew up, they love Jesus, they continue to this
Okay.
day. I keep in contact. So I couldn't be happier about the ministry than that part.
Yeah.
But so I want to be really clear about that. The we're talking about church planting, not necessarily all the good things that happen in the process.
Right.
So anyway, so I'm isolated, realizing that I'm not going to reach my goal, decide to stay, and asking what went wrong. In 1978, 79, Harold Decker picked me up to do a THM at Calvin Seminary, and I was going to study the history of the relationship of the church to its community in historical perspective. Long title,
Okay.
but that was Harold Decker. so, so I started studying the churches in Grand Rapids because I had access to all sorts of interesting information. I discovered a pile of yearbooks in the secondhand store in Grand Rapids, and I started reading about the history of the churches by the numbers.
Yeah.
Because I had math and physics as a background, I started plotting them and charting them and drawing graphs of their history. And I realized I knew something that nobody else knew,
Hmm.
and I wanted to share it. And I did my THM with that focus. And I charted out all the 100 and some odd churches in the Grand Rapids area, their church, their life, their growth cycles, how they moved about the city. And I discovered there was a pattern to it.
Hmm.
And this is, again, an element of where we'll end up going. But churches aren't just random. You can't just throw a church into Grand Rapids and think it will grow. No matter how many Christian Reformed churches are there, which are huge, if you put it in the wrong location, it won't make it.
Hmm.
If you put it a half a mile the other direction next to one of what I call the growth channels, it thrives.
Hmm.
And so the growth channels, if you get out a map, for all of you who don't know Grand Rapids, get out a map, trace Granville Avenue out of the center of the city, out to the south and to the west. Big churches were planted within hundreds of yards of that road, and they did well. If they were planted a little bit farther away from that, they didn't do well.
Huh.
And they came and they went. So Granville Avenue was on Granville, Broadway, Bethel, and then they moved on out of the city. They were very large, and they moved as the city grew. Each generation filled up its community. They filled up its church. 60 years later, churches have a natural life cycle of 60 years. And at the 60-year mark, the founding members, who were all homogeneous and they were all 20 years old when the church planted, 60 years later, now they're 80, they can't support the church. The church building is empty and their children have moved away. And they just moved further down the road. And so I could trace the 60-year cycle and the movement and the leapfrog of churches out of the city. And that's how I got to know all the churches, because the pattern was so predictable. And that's one of the things I want to share with this conversation today is, if you feel like I did in 1995 that you have failed, I have studied the lives and careers of so many pastors in the process. Very few of them you can see the difference they make rarely on their church membership charts.
So in other words, it didn't really matter who the pastor was. The church was going to do what it's going to do because of where it was located. And that
most
was
of the
story.
time. Now, that's not always true. So
Yeah.
I want to be really, really, really clear about that. That's not always true, because what you're doing in sunlight is different. But for the most part, that's true, whether it's in rural Iowa or Grand Rapids, Michigan, or in Silverdale, Washington. The patterns are very consistent. And so I realized, in 1995, skipping ahead to the doctoral research, so I spread the same concept around the country. Wherever you go, there's a cluster. And that cluster is the center, like a solar system, or like car dealers. Car dealers locate next to each other.
Yeah.
And you think, why? That's crazy. They steal each other's customers. No, people come to the cluster of dealers to find the best deals. Okay, so churches are the same way. Once they're a little bit isolated, if you go to Sioux Center is just so nice because people know it and it's so isolated. It's such a good example. You have the large churches at the center. It's the gravitational center. That's where you put your university. As you move out in radius, the churches become smaller and less stable. The growth movement is towards the center. It's never
back out to the edges.
Back out the radius to the remote churches. When churches fail, it's the periphery that fails. And it's the center that benefits always. The money goes to the center. The energy goes to the center. The life goes to the center. The programs and the activities. You don't see a great speaker volunteering to go speak out 30 miles out in the country.
Yeah.
They always go to the center. All the benefits go to the cluster. Now, not trying to complain about that, but trying to understand the dynamic of church growth. So I defined a cluster to be a circle with a radius of 20 miles. So huge, right? 40 miles diameter. That's a big circle. If you have 2,000 Christian Reformed church people inside that circle, and you want to plant a new church in there, your chances of success are about 80%. Success being 200. If you are outside that radius, your chances of success are 15%. The differences are just night and day. And so in the year 1970, when 8 churches were planted, so we organized 8 churches.
Yeah.
They were still 8. Working on my math skills. 8 churches in 1970. In 1995, they were still in ministry. 4 of them were beyond 20 miles from the center of their cluster. 4 of them were within 20 miles of their cluster.
Okay.
The 4 smaller ones had 65 members, 58 members, 120 members, and 191 members.
Okay.
All of them eventually closed. All 4 of them. The ones that were within the 20-mile radius had membership of 568, 759, 767, and 1052.
Okay, that's pretty noticeably different.
It's overwhelmingly different.
Yeah.
The cluster is the environment which people love groups. They love to be in a they thrive in clusters, and new churches thrive in clusters. So, with rare exceptions, the typical pastor will do far better planning a church closer to existing churches than remotely.
Yeah.
And
That
they need go ahead.
that's such an interesting insight, and I'll tell you why. Because even here in Port St. Lucie, because it's a growing city, we have had so many church planters come here, and because I have an interest in church planting, I've tried to take the opportunity to get to know them all. And here's what's happened in my time here. I've just noticed that Port St. Lucie is like a church planter's graveyard. People come here, they parachute drop in. They're not from this area. They don't know anyone. They are struggling, and then they die. It's just one church plant after the next. And I think what you're touching on is so important. All the resources come from they're imported from somewhere else. And once that stops, and it's going to stop because, yeah, it's just very rare that people are going to keep pumping resources into Port St. Lucie, Florida from Kansas City, Missouri. It's just eventually, people give up on that. Once the external resources stop, there's not an internal base. And I think what you're pointing out is you don't want to go out to wherever, Silverdale, Washington, or Port St. Lucie, Florida. If you're Christian Reformed, you want to plant in Grand Rapids, Michigan, because then all the resources are going to be local, and not just money resources, but people resources and relational resources and, institutional resources. It actually works out better if you're closer to a group of people not far from them. And I think that it's amazing that had to be discovered, because it seems common sense once you say it out loud. But I think so many church planting efforts have been a kind of parachute drop into the middle of nowhere to complete isolation where you're just stuck on your own.
Now, I want to affirm that very, very, very strongly, completely, everything you just said. I just want to make one little disclaimer,
Okay.
though. Early on, I said, I was writing a series of articles for Christian Courier magazine about 15 years ago or so. And I had a lot of time. The editor gave me all the time and space I wanted. So I wrote about 100 original pages with charts and graphs, the whole thing. I had speculated that it would be possible to create a synthetic cluster. Now, context.
What do you mean by that?
Let me explain this. This is critical, because this is what you've done in my language, what you have done. The original clusters like Grand Rapids or Sioux Center or Linden, Washington or Edmonton, Alberta, and whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
Those are the great magnets where you have the great pillar anchor church. That's Jerusalem if you're studying the book of Acts, right? 5,000 converts, yay.
Right.
You go further away and it's difficult. Well, we can't just plant churches in Grand Rapids forever. Eventually you're going to burn that out.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and somebody has to go to Silverdale. Somebody has to go to Port St. Lucie. But where do we go? How do we do this? So Home Mission's response, as nearly as I can tell, they didn't communicate with me, to tell you the truth. Once I wrote my dissertation, I asked them for feedback. I asked them as I wrote it. I asked them for help. Tell me what you think. But I didn't hear anything. So there we go. And then it was published in Calvin Theological Journal, and then I heard about it. But the denominational home missions began to send out a group of pastors to an area like that was the same as a cluster. So they send four pastors to a city. Well, four pastors is not the same as 2,000 people. It's
Right.
about 1,996 people short of 2,000. So, so that was one effort. I think it didn't work. What I had speculated was that it would be possible for the right person to create a synthetic cluster, not out of pre-existing Christian Reformed people in a 20-mile radius geographic area, but to build a cluster out of new relationships and new ties and new attachments. And as I
Yeah.
recall, and this is what I was so impressed with when we talked at Senate, was that you got to Port St. Lucie and said, I'm all alone. What'll I do? I'll go find the church next door. And that you did exactly what I had speculated might be possible. And then you started saying, well, we have a lot of snowbirds. And you gathered snowbirds. And you started gathering elements around your radius. And they combined together to create a community.
Yeah.
And I think that I had speculated that that could happen. I didn't know of an example of it happening, but I think that's exactly what you have done, and it is part of the story of why Port St. Lucie has been so effective.
Hmm.
Now, we haven't discussed this, and nobody's told me this, but this is the way I do research. I do it in isolation, so I hope I got it right.
Yes. I think, I'm not shy in saying it, which is one of the key factors in helping our ministry go here in Port St. Lucie was me meeting David Snapper in 2010. And it just struck me like you had sort of uncovered something that made so much sense to me. That if you're a church sort of in a denomination but existing in isolation, here are the kinds of things that can happen. One, as you raise up leaders, and this is true in our denomination, let's say you're raising someone up and they might become the associate pastor someday. Well, you've got to send them to seminary. Where's our seminary? Grand Rapids, Michigan. So you convince this person, hey, to take a next step, you need to move to Grand Rapids, Michigan, with the hope that they'll get trained up more and become more effective. And you're hoping, they'll come back to Port St. Lucie. Once they take off for Grand Rapids, they're not going to come back to Port St. Lucie. And I think, the way I thought about it is there's almost like this vacuum sound that all these churches in isolation, whatever gains they make, become the gains at the center. And it never comes back the other way.
That's right.
So as someone who is doing a lot of disciple making and leadership development, it struck me, okay, this can't be our strategy. We've got to raise up our leaders in place here. And, I started working with Calvin Seminary to figure out how can we do things at a distance, or how can we get more training but keep people here. And that's because of the talk that we had. It just dawned on me, okay, you didn't mention this, but I think I remember reading this in your articles. You talk about the 20-mile radius, and there's got to be 2,000 people. Well, that wasn't true of us at all. But you also talked about the presence of a Christian school as one of the factors. And we had started a preschool, but the more I thought about what will really make a church effective in being able to grow is, wow, we've got to get a Christian school going. And so eventually we were able to add on a kindergarten, then a first grade, and now, we're through 10th grade so far today, and we keep growing. And our being able to plant our daughter church, which is our PGA campus, sometimes people have said to me, why are you planting that church so close? It's just like a mile down the road. Shouldn't we take another part of the city? But the truth is, it really works well for our school to expand. So we took our junior high and high school and moved it over not that far away from us, and we planted another congregation there. And that has turned out to really be a positive. I think it's actually the close proximity that's making it go. And these are things that I realized or came to have some understanding about because I sat next to a guy named David Snapper in 2010 in Chicago. Um, Now, I'd like to reflect on this a little. Now that you kind of hear our story and how your wisdom affected us in our ministry here. I think I sort of had the impression that you went out of your way to learn all this, but struggled to get an audience to listen.
That is the truth. That is the truth, Scott. Yes, it has been an uphill battle. I'll just tell you that for sure. You know, the folks who were heavily invested in the School of Church Growth were not eager to change directions because of what I said. And I
Yeah,
mean,
there was a paradigm, and even though you were trying to bust through that paradigm, people weren't eager to change their minds.
right. And now this is one of those things you have to think about for a while, and I hope I can express it well enough. But the people who are making the models, who are writing the books, C. Peter Wagner, Carl
Yeah.
George, Donald McGavran, they are writing from, often as not, a cluster. And so they're saying, if I were planning a Christian church, the denomination Christian church, my
Right.
wife's from Cincinnati, is home of the Christian church. If you plant a church there, it's going to thrive. They're all big, they're huge churches there, sort of like our Grand Rapids. So
Yeah.
who will write a book that's published? It's somebody who's right there at the epicenter of the denomination. So their book will be taken as the sort of the gold standard for everyone else. Well, if you're 1,000 miles away, a different set of rules apply because you're now in Ephesus, you're not in Jerusalem.
Yeah, what
Right?
do you
And that
know?
just, yeah, yeah. So the people who made the paradigms often lived in this world of like in the super mega cluster. So C. Peter Wagner once wrote a book on how your church can grow, and he gave 4 church models on how to grow. Not one of his examples included a church that grew significantly. He wrote a whole book on it. You can read it, and he doesn't have examples of churches that actually grew in a significant way. His best example was one, I think, in Pennsylvania, a church of a few thousand people that grew a few hundred more or something like that. It was
Okay.
just incredible. But so these guys made the models, and they sort of controlled the narrative. I was blessed to have an experience like what you're doing. The thing is called when a local disciple is raised up, sent to school, is called redemption lift. I don't know if you know that word.
Redemption lift. Okay. First time I'm hearing this term.
Okay.
Describe it.
Donald McGavran's in India, being a missionary. He has a first convert in the village. Now, McGavran discovers that you can convert people retail, one person here, one person there, one person. But if you convert the chief, the whole village gets converted.
Okay.
Okay. Here's your cluster mentality.
Yeah.
Okay, but you take this one kid who's promising to be a pastor, you send him to the school of church growth, Fuller School in Los Angeles. He gets his PhD at Fuller in Los Angeles. Does he want to go back to the village in India?
Right.
And he's redeemed, and he's lifted out of his home village. And he goes off to be a professor at Fuller and tell everybody how it's done.
Right.
Okay? So that's the school I went to was part of an existing, very successful church in the Seattle area, Overlake Christian Church. And so that school, the pastor said, I don't want to send all my best and brightest off to Fuller. I want them to stay here. And so he would bring in great speakers, made a school right inside of his church, and he kept his disciples in the church, just like you're describing. So congratulations for that. And that's where I went to school. And so he kept his disciples. He trained them right there. He got them degrees. He got them everything they wanted.
Yeah.
and let us outsiders come in and pay for it. So it's a brilliant strategy. So
Now,
that was an answer.
this is sort of where I want to guide this conversation toward, because at least it seems to me that, the paradigms that existed at the time weren't ready to listen to. It's almost like common sense. Like, when I think about it, what you describe is so common sense that it's surprising there would be anyone who would fight against it. It seems like your research shows what if you weren't biased and you just sat back and thought about it, your research sort of proves what I guess we would naturally think, but the paradigm was different, so no one would listen. But I think, at least for me, it was so significant that I talked to you, because I was in a place like Silverdale in Port St. Lucie that was far from the center, struggling with the kind of issues that you had spent your life thinking through, and you gave to me what I consider to be like common sense advice. So part of my thinking is like, wow, we should put David Snapper in charge of our church planning strategy. If we're a denomination, why shouldn't he be in charge? So now that's kind of where I want to lead the conversation. If someone was going to say, hey, David Snapper, we are now at a crossroads in our denomination. We've got to come up with a new vision for church planting. What are the kinds of things that come to your mind as like, hey, I'm not saying you have to have some kind of all-knowing, method or strategy, but just based on your research, the things you've learned through experience, what kinds of things come top of mind to you as you think about, boy, if I was to help the Christian Reformed Church come up with a strategy for the next 10 years, what would come to your mind?
Thank you for that. I've been working at this for 47 years, and nobody's asked me that yet.
Which is surprising.
So thank you. I can't tell you how grateful I am to have the opportunity. One is to respect all the different kinds of church plants. Jerusalem is different than Samaria.
Okay.
And Samaria is not Antioch in Turkey.
Yeah.
And nor is it Jerusalem or Ephesus or Athens or Philippi.
Right.
And this is, I think, wildly important. I would read the book of Acts if you could read the book of Acts, just count the ways that Luke writes his numbers. Luke is very aware of numbers. So when he gets to Antioch, one day Paul is there and he's very successful. The next day, the Greeks invite all their friends to come back and they have a riot. Now, this is the nature of church planning. And it's the bucket theory. When the number of new berries outnumbers the elder berries or the former berries, somebody goes and tips over the bucket. And they had to break the church apart. I think respect each church for its nature and its environment and the circumstances. I think building a community is going to be critical for almost everyone. What you have done, this is completely unsolicited promotion, but here we go. I encourage my classes to send 10 people to the workshop that you're hosting.
Yeah.
Because I wrote about it in theory and speculated. You're building a network, or what I'm calling a synthetic cluster, that creates strength and it creates vitality. It creates options and pressure releases for all the little troubles that come along. You can talk with somebody who's your neighbor. You can have a school. I measured the cluster about 8 different ways because I'm a scientist. And as I measured it, it all came back to the same thing, that the dynamics of the cluster are important. The preachers critical as a catalyst, but he's not the only factor. Scott doesn't make all the things happen in the church. It's the church that's the church.
Right. Right.
You're the catalyst, you're the helper, you're the teacher, you inspire it, you do many things, and I don't want to diminish that. But it's the church on the street that's the church.
Right.
Um, and along those lines, I had mentioned many times that the church order that we hold so highly once protected us from the political machinations in Europe 200 and some odd years ago, when the faithful church was being oppressed by a state church and that sort of thing. So you needed this church order to protect yourself institutionally. But it's an institutional book, and it's what I call the human resources guideline, the manual for hiring and firing elders and preachers, right? It's not important. It's just the administrative structure. What's important is wouldn't we be better off to write a book on how the church should order its life, the people of the church. By the church, I mean the people. And so this morning, as I was thinking about this, preparing, I was thinking in Acts chapter 2, they're all converted. They knew exactly what to do. They got together, they got in each other's homes, they spoke one language, they were one culture, they were all Jewish, they all loved Jesus, they broke bread together, they listened to the disciples, they prayed, they knew where the temple was, they knew what the dress code was for the temple.
Right.
It was all pre-existing. That's the cluster.
Right.
You go to Athens, and you do have to go to Athens, no matter how hard it is, or Ephesus, and the people who are converts there don't know what the rules are.
Yeah.
So Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, look, here's how to make a rule book for the humans who are in the church. And this morning I was reading, it says you'll be saved in childbirth in 1 Timothy. And I thought about that for a while. And Diana, the goddess Diana, Artemis, was associated with childbirth. And if you're going to have a bad childbirth, she'll shoot you with a bow and arrow and kill you quickly so you don't suffer in childbirth. So terrific. Way to go, Artemis. But so he has to write. And Paul's writing Jesus against Artemis. That's the subject of the day. How do you live in a world where Artemis is the background logic? Now in Jerusalem, no problem. The battle was with Pharisees and Sadducees and a whole different world. You go just 1,000 miles away, and the battle is with Artemis. And how do you answer the claims that Artemis will protect you in childbirth? You got to say Jesus will protect you in childbirth. It doesn't mean, well, it's a confusing passage. We don't want to get too far afield, but the point is, everyone in their town will have their own Artemis or their own Mars Hill.
Right.
Or in Corinth, their own temples where they're having meals together. And everyone will have to adapt the culture or the gospel to answer the questions of its own culture.
Right.
So
there's a couple things you've said now that I'm just summing up. One is there's going to be different kinds of churches, and instead of trying to make everybody the same, we've got to respect that. The second thing I think I'm hearing is in every church, in every location, there's going to be unique challenges. And so the churches have to be free to contextualize Christianity, to answer their own particular challenges. And maybe from those two things, I'm thinking to myself, there's probably some things that are steady. This is what a church is. This is what a church does. And then there are some things where you have to let the local church have freedom to figure out how to address those challenges.
I would hope the steady part, we didn't talk about that too much, really, but the steady part, of course, must be the steady part that Jesus is the Son of God come to the world to live, to die for our sins, to be raised again, to be our hope for eternity. I mean, the core of the gospel doesn't change.
Right.
And in my context, the way I present it will have to answer different questions. So the culture will ask me questions that the gospel needs to answer,
Yeah.
but the gospel doesn't change. So
Right.
yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, that's good.
I
In my own way of thinking, I think you know, the point of this conference and what the denomination really is attempting to do is create a vision for church planting. But to me, actually, this conversation we're having right now is the first and necessary conversation. That, yeah, we have to first embrace a gospel identity. That it's actually out of the message of the gospel, what Jesus has done for us, who we are in light of Christ, his death, his resurrection. Until we kind of clarify the gospel for ourselves, for the community we find ourselves in, we're probably not going to make much progress. So actually, I think a conversation about the gospel, at least in my mind, is like the foundation or the core.
Right. So I yes, this is where the conversation needs to go. I think I laid a lot of foundation to help sort of lay out some of the dynamics of it. I think I made a mistake as a church planner. We wanted to make numbers. That was it.
Okay.
200 is the goal. That was it. 200. It was a number. And
Yeah.
you're reminding us that discipleship is what makes the church. You read all of a sudden Timothy and you say, Paul has to write Timothy because nobody in Ephesus knows how to be a disciple. They know how to be a
Yeah.
follower of Artemis. They know how to drink a lot of wine and go out to the city for the annual festivals. But how to follow Jesus is brand new territory.
Right.
And so you take this core gospel and you put it in language that the people of Ephesus could understand. I was interested in numbers. And
Okay.
I mean, I knew better. I wasn't only interested in numbers, but that's where the conversation was at. And it should have been on disciples. And disciples make churches, not numbers.
Yeah.
And we didn't get that. And if I could just pick up on what you said about being raised from the dead a moment ago, Jesus being raised. You know, in Jerusalem, when Peter says, and Jesus was raised, they go, uh-oh, we just made a terrible mistake. What will we do to be saved?
Yeah.
Now they're not thinking some big grand theological thing. We just killed
Right.
God's favorite son. You know, we're in trouble. You know, what do we do to get out of trouble? And so he says, well, you better repent. They all knew what that meant. They'd been schooled in it. But when you get to Athens and Paul's standing there, he gives this great sermon. Then he said, and Jesus was crucified and raised again. Well, they laughed at that. They were with him all the way until
Yeah.
that point. It's easy for us to go out in the street and preach a popular gospel,
Yeah.
right? But when you get to Jesus is different, Jesus is better, Jesus answers questions, Jesus is better than Artemis, and Jesus is better than the unknown God on Mars Hill. Jesus is raised again, and he's coming again. Well, the culture doesn't want to hear that. And so there'll come a point where there's a battle between you and the
Yeah.
culture. And we have to win it. You know, we
Yeah.
can't compromise it. We can't make it, well, Jesus is like the unknown God, and so that's okay.
Right.
No, he's the known God.
Right.
He's the raised God.
Yeah, I love this discussion. This is great. There's something else I want to pick up on because you started to talk about this, and as I think about what this plan should look like, I think it's got to be at the center, and that is disciple making. I don't remember who said the quote off the top of my head, but there's a quote, and I might not even get it word for word, but it's something like this. When you seek to build an institution, you rarely get disciples. But if you seek to build disciples, you'll get the institution of the church as well. And so actually, I think it's just like the natural after effect of really seeking to build disciples. Pretty soon, you have a church community. But if you set out and you're like, oh, let me build numbers and let me get a community, and you don't pause to really help people become disciples, you just wind up with sort of a mess. And it's been my experience that the most important thing we can do in the process of following the Great Commission is just what the Great Commission says: go and make disciples. And yeah, sometimes we're just a little too concerned with numbers and crowds, and we don't get concerned enough about the people who make up those crowds. And it seems to me that Jesus had these large crowds, but he really concerned himself with just his disciples. And I think, yeah, for me, I've developed a few little key phrases like go slow to go fast, go deep to go wide. And that's because if you just start with a few people and you go deep, eventually you'll find wide. But if you start, I want to go wide, you're never going to get this deep, rich. And the other thing that I think is really important, just as I think about something that I heard you talking about and just want to pick up on, is the value of relationships and community. I think actually that's probably at the core of what this cluster is all about. Is you've got relationships, you've got friendships, you're not isolated or alone. And I think one of the key things that I've come to really appreciate is that it just appears to me that whenever God does anything that we'll notice that's significant, it almost always starts with friendship. And I don't know that we talk about friendship enough or think about it enough, but I think that this building community through friendships and relationships is just way more important than we think. And I think any person who wants to plant a church probably ought to clarify to themselves that what they're trying to do is just build a network of friendships and relationships.
There's a great deal of truth in that. It's easy for the church to focus on its institutional structures and its officers and the church order in the administrative sense of the word. And we get involved in all these protocols and the meetings and committees, and all of that's fine. But it's not really the ministry. The ministry is to build disciples and to build relationships and like you're saying, the trust that allows people to visit together, to share their lives together, to grow together, to pray together. That part of the Christian life is far greater than the administrative part. That's why I've said that in these clusters, they know how to solve their own problems when a problem comes along. If there's an issue, what do we do about this subject or that subject? The answer that you find in a community will pretty much be the answer that works in that community.
Yeah.
So I mean, if the community solves a problem, the churches will solve a problem together, and they'll find a workaround, a strategy to address a complicated issue, and it may not be exactly the same one that some other community has, but they can work together and carry on as a community because they trust each other. They have pre-existing deep relationships of trust and prayer and care for each other. That, I think, goes a great long way. So planning your church, your second church a mile away or 2 miles away, whatever you said it was, builds that network of type. People can compare notes and build and grow together. Totally agree.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop for now. I really appreciate the conversation. I think, hopefully at some point we can have some more conversations because I know when I was reading the various articles that you had written and you were just printing them out at Synod, there was a lot of good thoughts with regard. I'll just give some examples to prime the pump for a future conversation. But I think you really had some great insight into the life cycles of churches. We spent some time, you just mentioned it today, like 60 years, and here's what happens. And in the midst of that, you talked about what happens when there's churches that are planting. So you have a congregation that's sort of been in place for 50 years, and then there's an upstart church plant right next door, and all the young people leave, and now there's animosity from one pastor to another. I think these kinds of conversations are interesting because, as I recall, you say, look, church planting is still worth it because even though there's some difficulty in that sustains that cluster for future times because now there's some new energy. So I think I'd like to have some more conversations about some of these things, but I think it's a good place to stop now. I don't know if you have anything quick you want to say about any of that.
I am just grateful for the chance to share some of this with you, Scott. And I've been working at this for years. I had a spine surgery two years ago and asked the surgeon if he was the right person to do my spine surgery because it's a high risk surgery. And so I said, "Are you the person? I don't know whether I should do this or not." And he looked at me and says, I have given everything I've got for the last 25 years to give you the best possible outcomes. And I said, "You're the man."
Okay.
And he did the surgery. And he was right. It was painful. I'm just getting over it now. I'm just starting to walk normally again, almost. But we can't solve all the problems and make them all go away. It's still going to be difficult. It's still hard to plant a church.
Yeah.
But we can do the best we can do in the environment by understanding it the best we're able to. And look in the book of Acts and say, Paul was thrown in jail and beaten and nearly died more than a few times. It's hard work. And we got to live with that.
Well, when you put it like that.
None of us have been shipwrecked, beaten, and left for dead.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, it's worth it. It is worth it. Don't be afraid of it.
Yeah.
And just know what it is, but don't be afraid.
Okay.
Jesus is still the Lord of his church.
Yeah. That is the perfect note to end on.
Thank you.
So anyway, David, thanks for joining us. And to everybody, we're glad that you've taken the time to watch this podcast. And we'll see you next week.